Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. I'm Craig Jeffrey, your host today. I'm joined by Sunny Gupta from Reddit, and our episode is called The IPO Journey, exploring Reddit's IPO and Treasury's role in it. Sunny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Craig. So excited to be here and talking about this topic.
I want to start off asking about what was the situation pre-initial public offering or pre-IPO and the decision to do an initial public offering. Maybe you could start with about Reddit, then get into the IPO. So maybe for the 8 people who don't know what Reddit does, maybe you could talk us through that.
Yes, absolutely. Just for those of you who do not know much about Reddit, Reddit was originally founded in 2005. It's basically a home to thousands of communities that we call subreddits, where users, or who we call Redditors, they connect over shared interest and participate in this discussion. It is one of the largest source of human communication over internet. It is a social media platform, but more focused around interests.
Excellent. I know there's a lot of interest too about all the data that's in there is now an extremely valuable data source. But maybe you could talk about the IPO, like what led to the decision to go into an IPO and what were you hoping to accomplish with that?
Yeah, I'll start with a little bit about pre-IPO and then talk about what was our decision process like. Pre-IPO, like Reddit filed confidentially in 2021 to go public. Pre-IPO, the company had raised capital, it was growing, it's expanding, but of course we were also investing in the growth and expansion. So the company was burning cash. We did have a couple rounds of capital that we raised from a private equity market, but ultimately the objective was to ensure that we are on a more steady path as a public company with 3 key objectives. First, we needed to ensure that our employees have access to liquidity. Much like most other technology companies, Reddit's employees get paid through company shares, RSUs or options. So we needed to ensure that employees get their liquidity. The second was we wanted to ensure that our users have a stake in our growth. They are a big part of Reddit community, and we wanted to make sure that through an IPO, once we become a public company or as part of the IPO, we carry the users along and they become our shareholders. From just stakeholders, they end up becoming shareholders. And the third aspect of the IPO was actually, ensuring a very broad participation and having the right shareholder group to ensure we continue to grow into the future. So those were the 3 key objectives, and we knew IPO was the only way for us to ensure that we are able to achieve these objectives. So that's what led to the decision of the IPO and being a public company.
On the process of hitting your first public offering, your initial public offering, I'd love for you to talk about your experience in what Treasury does on public company readiness. It sometimes varies in an organization who's doing it, but maybe you could talk about Treasury and the Reddit experience.
Okay. Yes, Craig, thanks for bringing up. It's such an important topic. And a lot of times, Treasury's role in an IPO just skims under the radar. Not many people understand what's Treasury's role. And the lack of this awareness doesn't allow the Treasury teams to either prepare or the financial leaders to tap into the right talent which Treasury has. So just quickly talking about the IPO process, I'll do it in 2 steps. One is I want to say the pre-IPO preparedness, readiness from a Treasury perspective. And then the second aspect is the actual IPO process itself. So just going back to the pre-IPO readiness, there are a lot of things that the Treasury team needs to focus on. I'd recently published an article on Forbes, which was where I published a framework that teams can use to refer to in their path to being a public company. I titled it the Tech Treasury IPO Framework because it focuses a little bit more on technology companies, but most companies should be able to use it. I pointed out 4 key pillars that the Treasury teams need to focus on. The first one would be the process, second, platform, third, policies, and the fourth is people. In no particular order, each of these are equally important, but I'll just go into a little bit into each of these four pillars. The first one, process. Ensure that all the Treasury processes, critical processes, are set up and are ready to operate as a public company. What does this mean? You have your liquidity management. Do you have your cash forecasting tools or models ready? Your employee liquidity. How are you thinking about employee liquidity should the IPO not happen in the process of it? Like how would you consider providing liquidity to your employees? Risk and compliance. This is like very, very critical because the SOX controls become significantly important as you become a public company. And when you say risk and compliance, there is also an aspect of how are you managing and evaluating your risks. You have financial risks, obviously, which you have like foreign exchange risks or interest rate risks. Important for some companies may not be important for others, depending on your stage of growth. But there is also the corporate risk program, which most treasuries do manage. One of the most important one would be the directors and officers insurance program, which is very, very important as you pivot from a private company to a public company. So that's the processes aspect of it. The second is platforms. Think about what platforms do you need to ensure to work at a scale. This could include your treasury management system. It could include your bank access management systems. It could be things like, your cash forecasting. How are you doing it? Or do you have internally built tools? This particular area has actually gone through a significant change in the last couple of years, with a lot of AI and ML-based cash forecasting tools being now readily available for you to implement. So if you do plan to implement it, this has to happen way before the IPO process. So you're testing it and ensuring it's working the right way. Then you have market information systems like FactSet, Bloomberg, that you need to understand, treasury teams need access to this. Do you have access to this? How are you working through that? The third one is policies. A couple policies are very, very critical. Most companies should have them, like the investment policy, the treasury operations policy, which kind of lays out the approval matrix or authority matrix, access matrix for your company on who has access to bank accounts, how do they approve user access, how do you approve, who approves payments, things like that. If foreign exchange or interest rate risk is critical to your company, then think about, do you have an FX risk policy which lays down the hedge rules? And the last aspect of it, and like I said, in no particular order, but I feel this is like very, very significant, is the people who are running your treasury team. Do you have the right talent? Do you have the right people who can support you now through the IPO process and post-IPO process as well? That, I would say, is like the pre-IPO preparedness. You need to ensure, even before the company decides to kick off the IPO process, these are the things that Treasury needs to focus on. And this doesn't happen in silo. Work with your internal audit team to ensure your controls are up to the mark. Work with your accounting team to ensure the information is rightly flowing through the systems, and where can Treasury continue to support better accounting processes. Work with your legal team to ensure that all the policies that you need to have in place before the IPO are in place and approved by the right people. So there are a lot of stakeholders that Treasury needs to continue to work with through the IPO preparedness process. I'll pause here for a minute. I know I spoke for a long. If there are any questions.
I like your alliteration with the 4 Ps, the 4 pillars. Is this primarily for pre-IPO, or how much of this flows through the IPO and post-IPO, those 4 things?
I would say it's primarily for pre-IPO. A lot of this continues to be the focus post-IPO as well. But the expectation is before you're a public company, you have some of these policies in place. You have some of these processes in place. The platform and people kind of go through an evolution as the company grows, but the policies typically stay the same, or the processes are already established. Obviously, they'll continue to evolve as the company continues to evolve, but I think platforms and people is where you see most significant change post-IPO.
Would you put something like making sure your banking structure is aligned for good cash concentration mobilization and supporting an effective forecast? Is that part of platform, or is that more under the policy bucket?
Great question, actually, Craig. I would put that more under processes to ensure your bank structure is optimal. As a private company, when the companies start, you typically start opening bank accounts. You don't have a significant banking relationship, so you will open accounts with banks that are providing you some credit. But are these the banks that you would be able to continue to work with? Is this the right structure of the accounts? Those are the things that you need to start considering pre-IPO. Depending on the scale of the company, the cash pooling might come before or the after. I would put it as part of platforms, but I would say like pre-IPO, most companies I would expect may not have a cash pooling structure in place because they are slightly smaller, who are continuing to evolve, especially on the international side. But it becomes a very critical aspect of it as the company continues to grow. It's not IPO dependent, it's more the company size dependent, I would say.
Great, thanks for that. So what would you and your colleagues at Reddit say was unique about your IPO?
There were a lot of unique things about the Reddit IPO. Just going back to what I mentioned were our objectives when we were going to go public is ensuring liquidity for employees, users as stakeholders, and broad participation in the IPO and thereafter in company's success. We tried to tackle each of these objectives, and Treasury was a critical part of ensuring that these objectives are achieved. Now, let's take the first one, employee liquidity. We ensured that employees had access to liquidity at the IPO. What happens in a typical IPO is that there is a lockup structure where employees are not able to sell their shares for the first, usually it's up to 6 months, which is 180 days. So employees don't have access to liquidity for up to 180 days post-IPO. What we did is we ensured that employees, there is a secondary component within the IPO where employees were able to sell their shares as part of the IPO. The company was doing the marketing and employees were able to sell it. Now, why is this important? One, it was a critical objective for our IPO. Second, what was Treasury's role in this? Firstly, it was to ensure how much capital does the company need? What's the IPO size? How much does the company need to raise? And how many shares can the employees sell? So that aspect of what should be your primary versus secondary component ratio, that's where Treasury became very critical to help us understand like how many shares can the employees actually sell. And then work with your equity team to ensure you have the right structure to be able to allow these employees to sell. Reddit actually had one of the largest number of people selling as part of the secondary sales. That's actually like the first unique aspect of the IPO. The second, where I said we wanted our users to be our stakeholders. Again, Treasury was a very important aspect of this because we had what we call the directed share program as part of our IPO, where 8% of our IPO was set aside for our users and moderators and a few other stakeholders, but primarily for the Reddit users and moderators. What this means is most of the time the IPOs are marketed to institutional investors. They have access to buy the company shares at the initial price. Retail investors usually don't get the same amount of participation. With the directed share program, what we did is we ensured that these retail participants, who are our users and moderators, had the same access to Reddit shares as an institutional investors. And setting aside 8% of our IPO, that is like potentially one of the largest DSP or directed share program allocation that any company had. But we also wanted to ensure it has the broadest access. So we had all our US users who had an account with us before of Jan 1st, 2024, that was our cutoff. Anyone who had an account with Reddit was able to participate within the directed share program. So that's like giving the broadest access possible to your users and moderators. Now think about the IPO. They were able to buy these shares at $34. The day one price, and I'm not even talking about the price today where the share price is 200 plus, but the day one closing price itself was $50. The amount of value that we were able to generate for our users and moderators, that reflects that we were very successful in achieving the secondary objective. Again, what was Treasury's role in this is we worked with the internal teams as well as our external underwriter to ensure that we have the platform to be able to allow these users to register and apply for these shares, ensure that we are screening the people. These are the right people, these are our users, and then they get the access to these shares.
Users are called Redditors, but are the moderators also called Redditors?
Yes, our moderators are all volunteers. They are interested in this topic. They most likely would have created the subreddit as well, or have, decided that they would like to support the subreddit by moderating it.
Yeah. So as you talk through that, some of the unique aspects, I'd also be interested to hear, is there anything else on what were the key steps or key learning points that you got from going through this process? Anything that you want to spike out?
Yes, I want to say Treasury professionals are very uniquely positioned to be able to add value to your company's IPO process. A typical IPO, just if you focus purely on the IPO process, it usually takes anywhere from 4 to 6 months. Think about the start of it. What's the start of it? It's basically selecting your underwriters. These are the bankers that you have worked with. These are the relationships that you have built over the years. You are a critical part, you as in the Treasury professional, is a critical part of ensuring that the right syndicate is coming together. You reach out to these banks, you work with these banks, help the CFO decide who the right syndicate members would be for you. So right from the start, you are part of it. Second, what's the IPO size for most companies? Again, very dependent on Treasury inputs of forecasting the cash to understand how much capital does the company need and what's the float going to be? Like how many shares would we want to sell? I'll draw from Reddit's experience where I said, we tried to balance between the company's need to access the capital markets versus the employees' need for liquidity. We were able to balance that out. So again, Treasury is a very critical part of putting that together. Another important aspect of the IPO is your investor meetings, your research analyst meetings, the valuation model, or the model basically that you prepare. Most likely FP&A teams take the lead on this, on creating the models, but Treasury needs to provide input on the cash side of it to ensure that, not just the income statement, but also the cash flow statement is reflecting what you expect from the company. And then work with the FP&A team to rightly prepare materials for investor meetings or the analyst meetings. Execution. That's the day of the IPO. That's another important place where you are involved to ensure that the information is filtering in rightly from the banking partners or the syndicate partners, and it's channeling through the right people. So I would say from start to the end, the IPO process, you have the right talent within Treasury to be a very critical part of the CFO staff throughout the process.
Yeah, I know how much involvement varies from company to company, so that was pretty helpful to talk through what you and your team did there. Before we move on to the day of the IPO and post-IPO, can you tell me a little bit more really quickly about your career, and a little bit more on what are you responsible for at Reddit?
Yeah. So I'm the director of Treasury at Reddit, which means I oversee all of the Treasury function, be it capital markets, capital planning, liquidity management, risk, and compliance. All of this falls within my purview, which is pretty exciting because you get to work on very different things throughout the day. That's my role within Treasury. And just quickly on my career, I've been with Reddit for about 4 years now, joined Reddit in 2021. But prior to that, I was with General Motors, again in Treasury, doing different roles. I was with General Motors for 4 years. And again, it was a rotational program. So I touched on capital planning, Treasury operations, supplier risk management, and a couple other areas within General Motors. I did my MBA from Northwestern Kellogg School of Management, graduated in 2017. Post-graduation, I've been with General Motors. But even before my MBA, my experience is pretty varied. I started with investment banking. I worked in investment management. I worked in venture capital just immediately prior to joining Kellogg for my MBA program. So I have a very varied experience where I've drawn from all of these experiences. And I feel like that having this varied exposure has truly helped me to be a very well-rounded finance professional.
Thanks for the background. I know it's always helpful for people to know who's talking to them, and some background there is helpful. Let's shift over to the day of the IPO and post IPO. Can you give us some of the highlights for day of and then after that?
Yeah. The day of the IPO, I would say it's very exciting. There is not much that the team needs to actively do. So the day prior to the IPO, the allocations are decided, the pricing, the final pricing is decided. So everything is set in motion. And on the day of the IPO, which is the listing day, is when the shares start trading publicly. I was fortunate enough to be in the New York Stock Exchange on the day of the IPO and see the first trade come through and be excited and cheer for the company and for the team on a job well done. So when you price the IPO at 34 and the first trade goes for higher than that price, that is truly very exciting. And then it continued to stay high throughout the day. It was a pretty exciting day for us. What happens after the IPO is also very important. There are two aspects to this. One is Reddit as a technology company, and this is not unique to Reddit, but most technology companies would have it, is most of the restricted stock units, the stock compensation that is offered in shares, vest on the day of the IPO. And you have 2 days to remit the taxes to the IRS. And that's very critical because Treasury is a critical part of that, and we need to manage the liquidity. This is millions of rupees because all of the RSUs, now depending on the length of the employee tenure and the historical, like how long has been the company's history, it could be very significant amount. And you need to plan the liquidity for it. And it's very time sensitive. That needs to happen. And the second aspect of it is you will receive the IPO proceeds. What are you going to do immediately with it is very, very, very important. Like most companies don't have like an immediate need for that liquidity. They are not acquiring another company the third day of the IPO. So you need to ensure that the IPO proceeds are appropriately invested, depending on what's the company's liquidity requirements in the short, medium, or the longer term. Divide the basket into, is this going to be my operational liquidity or is this an excess liquidity that I have, and where would that excess liquidity go? So that's another aspect of the post-IPO that you need to immediately attend to within the next couple days of the IPO. But then once the IPO journey is done, it's a high, but you also need to continue to think of, the earnings are going to be out next. So what is Treasury's role in earnings preparation, and how are we going to continue to work as a public company? And again, I'll go back to the framework and say, look at all the 4 areas. Are there any processes that need to change? Are there any platforms where we are deficient and we need to implement these as we continue to grow? Do we have the right policies? Is there anything lacking? Does anything need to change on an annual basis? Review these policies on an annual basis. And then and the last aspect of it is the people. You probably ensure that you had the right talent to help you through the IPO and even the post-IPO, but continue to evaluate. Do I have more, additional requirement for people? Is there any talent that needs to continue to change? Treasury, finance, broadly technology is evolving so significantly that it's important for your talent to stay in touch with what's the evolving need of Treasury.
Thanks for that. So I'd just love to wrap up on any final reflections or thoughts that you had that you just wanted to leave at the end for anyone in Treasury who might be at a non-public company who may be considering going public or is in the process. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, Craig, one of the things that you mentioned is depending on the company, the involvement of Treasury might differ. One of the things I do want to mention to the Treasury, any Treasury professional is take the initiative to reach out to your leaders and ask the question, how can Treasury help? And how can I be part of this journey? How can I contribute better? How can I contribute more? So do not hesitate to ask that question because there is always going to be a need for talent and the right people throughout the IPO journey. So don't hesitate to ask. Opportunities don't come to you. A lot of times you have to seek those out as well. And once you start tapping into it, you realize how much value you can bring. And then obviously the team will also realize that. I would say the other aspect of it, it's just a parting thought, is It is a very exciting journey that you would be on if you are a pre-IPO company and who is preparing for the IPO journey. But then it doesn't end there. The company will continue to need capital. So you will be thinking of either, follow-on opportunities, equity offerings, or debt capital market. Now you need to evolve from equity to debt as the capital as the capital needs change. There are so many things that you need to start thinking about. So be a strategic thinking partner to your CFO. Your role doesn't end with the IPO. Your role is not just operational. You need to start thinking about what strategic needs does the company have.
So once you celebrate that at the New York Stock Exchange, the next day it's back to work, making sure you have liquidity and planning. Oh, that's great. Thanks so much, Sunny. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Craig. It was so exciting to be here. Obviously, Strategic Treasurer is a resource that I continue to use. There are a lot of webinars out there for folks who probably haven't explored it as well. Do go there. There are really, really helpful webinars and knowledge resources available on the site.
We'll take that commercial from you, Sunny. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.